So in this session, I wanted to talk about how you do communication between components in AngularTO. And I'm going to be breaking this down into a few different categories. So communicating from a parent component into the child component, the flip side of that, when you have a child component that needs to send some message to its parent, and when you need to communicate between two sibling components. But before we dive into the details, I just wanted to kind of level set and make sure we're all on the same page here on what a component actually is. So in AngularTO, pretty much everything is a component. You're going to have one root component that encompasses your whole application. And then you can break down the different parts of your app into separate components, like so. You can use components for code reuse, so we might have a component for each link in the header or something like that. They're just good for organization and encapsulation. And essentially all a component is a way to encapsulate some markup and some logic. So you can see an example of a really basic component here. We've just got this inline template here that's just going to say content and then render out some dynamic content. And then we have some logic to control that markup and set that myvar field. So if I give this to Angular, give it my comp, it'll see that there's a selector in a component that matches that. So it will render out the template, and it'll allow our custom logic here to pass a custom message into our component. All right, so components are good at encapsulating this logic, but what about when you need to break out of that encapsulation and communicate between them? So let's say I have a parent component, and I just want to pass a string down to the child component and have the child component render that out. So I could do that with a setup like this. So basically how it'll work is I'll define a variable in my parent component. I'll pass that into a binding on the child component. And Angular knows how to hook up this binding from this square bracket param to this param variable in the child because I've annotated this with the @input annotation. So once I pass this into the child, then I can just render this out in the child. So if I give Angular my parent component, it will render out that parent template with the child template inside it, and I'm able to pass this hello message from the parent into the child. All right, so let's take a look at a slightly more real-world example. So I have this really basic app here. It has a text box and a title, but we're going to be fleshing this out a bit, and basically all we want to do is display a list of users and allow us to search those users in this text box. So if we take a look at the code, here's that component we were looking at. We've just got the title here and an input field. And you can see in the class for this, in the constructor, I'm iterating through this loop and populating this array with users. This user.fromMockData is just going to go and create this user object and use this faker library to make a bunch of fake information about a user. But we're not actually seeing the users on the page. And that's because we're not doing anything with this user object. It's just sitting here in my class. And I have a child component here, user search results, where I want to show the list of users based on what the person has typed in. So we can take a look at how this component works. And you can see the template for it. We are just going to iterate over this list of users and then display their ID, address, email, stuff like that. But this users array is never actually being set to anything. So I want to take that users array from my parent and pass it down into the child. So like we saw on the slides, I can just annotate this with input, and I'll add an import statement for that. And now for my parent, I can pass the users into that input. So I'll say users, and that should be pretty much all I have to do to pass that users into my child component. So again, I'm declaring this array in my parent component, initializing with some values, passing it into a binding, and that Angular knows about this binding because I've annotated that with the @input annotation. So if we take a look, now we have this great list of users. Sweet. But we can go one step further with this, because right now the search isn't working. So let's see what we could do to implement that search. OK, so in my parent component, let's go back to the parent component. I have this input field, and you can see I'm just binding whatever the user types into it into this first name search variable using ngModel. And in my search results component, I have this function for filtering the list of users. So I can call this with a list of users and the search string, and it will go and filter out all the users who have a first name that matches that. So I could create an input binding and pass the search string in here, but I don't really have any way of knowing when to call filter users, right? I want to refilter the users whenever that search string changes, but if I just create an input binding, I won't really be able to do that. But there's a way that we can do this. So let's first create the input binding. So we'll call it search string, and we'll annotate this as an input binding. Okay, so instead of just having this be a plain property, I can actually make this an ES6 setter. So if I say set, give this a value that it takes in. Now I have a function that gets called whenever that value gets set. So now I can call my filter users function. So we can call this filter users. I'll just pass in the users, this users. And I'll pass in the value, so that is the search string. And I need to store this array of filtered users somewhere, so let's create an array for that. So say filtered users is a user array. And now in the template, I'm just going to iterate over the filtered users instead of the full list of users. So we'll iterate over filtered users. Remember to store the result of this in here. Okay, so now we've got this input binding where I can pass the string in. So let's go to the parent component and actually pass that string in. So I want to pass in a search string of first name search. Okay, so I think that should work with any luck. So again, we've got this input binding in our parent where we're binding whatever anyone types into the text box to this first name search, passing that into the child through this search string. And then whenever that gets set to a new value, we're going to rerun this filter users function. So let's give this a shot. If I search for, say, anyone with Nick in their name, sure enough, I get this Nicholas guy. So awesome, this seems to be working. So this is great because we only have like a couple inputs and it's pretty simple. What if you have a whole bunch of inputs for your component and whenever any of them changes, you need to update a bunch of things. So instead of using an ES6 setter on each one, there's actually a way we can get Angular to just call a function for us whenever any of the inputs change. So if I say that this class implements, I think it's ng on change, something like that, or maybe it's just on changes. Implements on changes. Okay, so now I can implement this interface, and basically all it is just this ng on changes function. So let's bring that down here, and Angular will call this for us whenever any of the inputs get set to a new value. So I can basically just run my code that refilters the users whenever anything changes. We can log out what these actual changes are. Normally, you might actually care about what changed and do something conditionally on what changed, but we're just going to rerun the function whenever this changes. And now I don't need this to be a setter anymore, so I can just set this back to a plain old property. And instead of value, I'll access that property. So I have this dot search string. And this should basically do the exact same thing as before, except that now if I were to add more input fields, or let's say the users array could actually change, then my filtering would automatically re-happen and I wouldn't have to make users also an ES6 setter. So if we give this a shot, we can take a look at what it's logging out to the console. So if I search AGL, I get this guy, and you can see what it's logging out is just whatever has changed. So it's saying search strings changed from AG to AGL. So you could do much more advanced things with this and actually do some conditional handling of these changes instead of just running a function. But to recap, input bindings, really useful for passing something basic into a child. If you need a bit more control, you could use something like an ES6 setter or this ng on changes. All right, let's add some more functions to this app. So let's say we wanted the ability to add a new user. And we want a modal that lets us enter in the details for this new user. So if I go to my user app, I actually already have a modal component, which is very handy. So let's take a look at this modal component. It's just got some inline styles here. The template is wrapped in this ngIf. So whenever this show variable is true, we're going to see the modal. Whenever show is false, it's not going to see the modal. And the modal is pretty basic. It's just a form with a field for first name, last name, address, and email. And then we have a cancel and submit button. So how would I actually trigger this show to become visible when a user clicks a button? So I could create another input binding for this. We can see that show right now is just this private variable, but I could make this public and annotate it with input so that I can pass the show variable in. But that's not going to do quite what we want, because I want to be able to hide the modal from inside the modal component. I don't want to just have it controlled from the parent. I want to be able to click cancel or submit and change the value of show. And I also want to be able to get some information back from the modal when the user submits it. So when the user submits, I want to get that user object back. And there's actually a function in here that does exactly what we want. So this open function will set that show value, and then it returns a promise that will resolve when the modal gets closed, and it will resolve with the user that got created if they click submit, and the promise will get rejected if they click cancel. So you can see when I click submit here, we're going to resolve that promise with the user. When I click cancel, we're going to reject it. So it would be nice if I could just directly call this open function from the parent component instead of needing to set up a bunch of input and output bindings to try and coordinate this. And I actually can do that. There's a couple ways you can do it. So one way is with a local variable. So if I create, I guess first I'm going to have to start using that modal directive. So let's grab the selector for it. Okay, we'll use it here. And now I can add a local variable. So we'll just call this modal. And this will get set to an instance of the create user modal component. So now I could have a button. Let's grab a button here. All right, so let's have a button here that's add user. And whenever I click it, we can start calling things directly on that modal. So I can call modal.open. So let's give this a shot. So again, what's happening here is I'm using this new child component. I'm just getting an instance of the child component and directly calling a function on it from my parent. So now we've got this new button. I click add user, and sure enough, it opens the modal. But I'm not doing anything with the response, right? The whole point of calling this function was so that I could get the promise back. And I mean, I guess I could start handling the promise in my template, but this is obviously going to get out of hand pretty fast. And I want some custom code in my controller to actually handle this. And unfortunately, the way that these local variables work is that you can't access them in the class. You can only access them in the template. They're really just for kind of convenience when you're just doing something within the template and don't need access to it in the class. But there's another way we can do it where I actually get access to this in the class. Because what I really want is a field in my class that is an instance of that create user modal. So let's create that. So create a modal that is an instance of create user modal. And I can annotate this with view child and just tell it the type of component that I want to grab. So we say we want to grab a create user modal. And what Angular will do is search through my template and try and find an instance of create user modal, which it'll find in this create user modal component, and it will go and set this modal to the value I want. So now I can create a custom function for adding users. So let's say add user, where I call that modal's open function. And now I can handle the promises in here. So I can have a promise where we get the user. We could also catch it and handle the cancel case. And all I'm going to do in here is just add this new user to my users array. So let's say this users.push this new user. And now I need to call this add users function when I click the button instead of calling the child component directly. Okay, so with this, I feel like I'm missing something, but no, this sort of looks right. We'll see what happens. So I've got this create user modal. I'm getting an instance of it using Angular's view child. Yeah. So this is WebStorm. Yeah, it's a great. Yeah, and it's in presentation mode. Normally it looks more like this, but I've just got it in full screen mode so you can read the code. Yeah, it's a great tool for. Yes, yeah. So it's an ECMAScript 6 promise, and I've got polyfills so that I can use those promises using core.js. Yeah, I mean, you're using classes, so it's definitely more object-oriented. Okay, so let's try out this modal. If I add in, if I try and actually submit someone, say test, 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 and test. Okay, let's add this user. So they should have gotten pushed to the end of my array, but I'm not seeing them. Let's try searching for them. So if I search for test, I do actually see this test user. And if I get rid of my search and go down, my test user is still there. But for some reason, when I submitted the modal, the test user didn't show up right away. So let's take a look at what's actually happening and what could be causing that. So when I click add user, I push a new user into this users array. And then the child component that shows those search results, it's using that ng on changes to update the filtered list whenever anything changes. But the way the ng on changes works is it only gets called when you actually replace an input with a new value. So if you mutate an input, an object, you change a field on the object, ng on changes won't get called. So basically, this function isn't getting called until I change that search string, and then it's recomputing. So what I could do to fix that is just not mutate the object and just create a new object. So let's just create a new array that has this new user in it, and then all the users from the previous array. And if you're not familiar with this ... syntax, this is the ES6 spread operator, and it'll basically, it's similar to if you were to take this array and write every element out with a comma in between them. That's basically what it's doing. So it's essentially just going to let me concatenate this new user onto this old array, and in the process create a new array instead of push, which will actually mutate the array. Once this reloads, we can try this again, and hopefully we see the user right away now. Say test, 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 and sure enough, now the user gets created right away. So that's just something you have to be a bit careful about when you're mutating objects. Sometimes Angular's change detection isn't going to detect that, and I'll go over some other various ways that you can avoid these kinds of problems. All right, let's go back to the slides and talk about the flip side of this. So let's say you have some event happening in a child and you want to communicate that to your parent. So let's say I've got this parent and child component, and the child component is just going to have a button, and when I click it, I want to send a message to the parent and have the parent log that out. So the way that this can work is I create a button with a click binding, and whenever the button gets clicked, I'm going to call child_events.emit. So child event is an event emitter. So this is a type that comes from AngularTO that lets you emit events. And I've annotated it with @output. So this tells Angular that I can actually pass this information up out of the child component. And you can see I'm binding to that output with the round bracket syntax using child event. And I'm going to just call this custom function to log out a message whenever that happens. All right, let's go back to the user example and see what we could do here, doing an output binding. So let's say I wanted to add a delete button onto each of these users in this list. The problem is that the list of users is stored in the parent component, but where I'm actually putting that delete button will be in the child component. So I'll need to communicate to the parent that I want it to delete one of the users. All right, so let's go into the search results. Let's create a delete button. So I'll just put it up in the heading here. I'll just create a span. And we'll just have an X here. So whenever I click this X, I want to send a message to the parent. So similar to in the slides, I can create an event emitter. So let's call this remove user equals new event emitter. And I can add an import statement, import this from Angular core, and annotate this with @output so that I can bind to it from my parent. And again, add an import statement. Okay, so now I've got this event emitter, so I just need to emit an event whenever someone clicks on the X. So let's add a click binding. We'll call remove user emit and just pass out the user that got clicked. Okay, now from the parent, I can bind to that. So let's create a function for handling that. So we'll call this remove user. And this will take in that user. And I'm just going to filter out my array of users. So let's say we'll set this .users to this .users.filter. And we'll just go through all of the users and say if the user's ID is not equal to the one I'm deleting, then we'll keep it. So something like that. Now I just need to call this whenever that child component throws an event. So my user search results has this remove users event where I want to call remove users and pass in that $ event. And that's what lets me get the actual value that it's passing out. All right, so to recap, child component created an event emitter, which we've got down here. It annotated it with output so that I'm able to actually bind to it. Whenever I click on the X, we're going to call emit and send an event out on that event emitter. And then in the parent, I'm going to catch that event and update the user array. So let's give this a shot. All right, that actually worked. So now I've got this delete button where I can delete some users. So that's a basic usage of output. Let's switch now to a slightly more advanced application and see what we can do with child to parent communication. Okay, so I've got this wizard application, which is an application where we can create some wizards and then display them here, and then we have a 3-step wizard for making wizards. It made sense at the time. It's gotten a little confusing since then, but you get the idea. But there's some bugs of this problem right now. So right now, if I select the type of wizard, go to the next page, I could enter some information here, but let's say I wanted to go back and update my wizard. I lose all of the information about that wizard. So this wizard component here is not maintaining its state when I navigate through these pages. So let's take a look at how this app is actually structured. If I open up the main, so here's where I'm setting up the routes, and you can see there's a home route here with a component that will display that list of wizards, and then there's a wizard route, which is a 3-step wizard for creating wizards. And those 3 steps are the sort of sub-routes in the router that all have their own component. And this first sub-route is the one we're running into issues with, so this wizard type component. So let's take a look at how it's implemented. It's pretty basic. We just have this input type radio that is binding its value to selected type. And then selected type is just being stored on this component, and then I'm not doing anything with it. So the problem with this is that if we go back to the router, this wizard type component is going to get destroyed when I move on to the next step, when I go onto this info page, and I'm going to lose any state that's on it. So I need to find somewhere I can store this state for the wizard type component that will actually be maintained throughout the whole wizard component's lifecycle. So I could create a service. This is probably what you do in Angular 1. You'd create a global service, store everything on there. The problem with that is you need to manually clear that state. If I go back to the home page, I don't want to keep all the state from what I entered in that form. So I'd have to find a way to find out whenever you're trying to navigate away from the page and manually clear that state, which is actually not that hard in Angular 2, but there is a place I can put this state that already has the exact sort of life cycle that I need, and that's on this parent component. So this wizard component will get created whenever you navigate to any of these child pages, and it will stay created until you leave the page. So if I go back to the home page, this will get destroyed, and all the state on it will also get destroyed. So if I could just create an output binding on this wizard type component, send the type up to the parent whenever it gets selected, then I can safely store it, that state on the parent without fear of losing it when I want to keep it around. So let's take a look at the wizard component. So this is the parent component. And so here's where I would want to be binding to my child component's output events. But you can see I'm not directly using the child components. I'm just letting the router dynamically inject them with this router outlet. So there's no way I have to directly bind to their output events or send them input events. So the output events just aren't really going to work for us in this case. but I can actually get an instance of this wizard component in my child component, similar to how in the first example we were able to use that view child to get an instance of the child directly into the parent. And this is actually even easier. I can just take this wizard component and inject it directly into the child component's constructor. So I can say wizard comp, and we'll make this public so I can access it. And now I can access this directly in my child component's template. The wizard component has a wizard field on it, and wizard has this type, age, image, and name field, so I want to bind to that type field. So now this will store it directly on the parent. And I wanted to just step back for a second and think about what just happened here. So I'm editing an AngularTO binding inside of an HTML template, inside of an ES6 template string, inside of my TypeScript annotation, and somehow I'm able to get autocomplete on all of this. So you can see here, this actually knows that this is a wizard, and it knows what the fields are on wizard. So this is, in my opinion, one of the most game-changing features in Angular 2 is that it's actually machine readable, and your IDEs can actually understand the templates and know where the bindings are, and with TypeScript know exactly what is allowed and what's not allowed. And this is fully supported in WebStorm and VS Code, and I'm sure all the other IDEs and editors will be pretty quick to follow. So just a quick aside on cool IDE features. But that should be basically all we need to do to fix the bug with this app. Sounds like it's reloaded. So if I try and create a wizard now and go back to the previous page, we see I don't lose that state anymore because it's being stored on the parent component. So we can just go through the whole process, create a wizard here, submit it, and sure enough, I get my new wizard. So the whole process worked. All right, let's go back to the slides. I can close this guy. And move on to the last topic of sibling-to-sibling communication. And really the trick here is that you can't do it. There's no @sibling binding where you can directly bind to something on a sibling component. You have to, if you want to communicate with a sibling, you have to do it sort of indirectly. So one way we could do this is inject the same service in both components and sort of set something on the service from one and then retrieve it in the other. So a really simple example of how this might work is with the following two sibling components on the left and this service on the right. So my sibling 2 here just has a button, and when I click it, it's going to call this function on the service, and then the service, or the first sibling 1, has a binding to that value. So when I click my service.increment, that will increment this counter value, and we will see that incrementing on the first sibling. There's some problems we can run into with this technique. So let's take a look at let's go back to that user demo and take a look at how it is not going to work. So let me just check out a different branch. Let's get rid of all my old changes. All right, so let's see if this is reloaded yet. Not quite yet. Okay, so the way the app is structured now is I have this one parent component that is going to have two sibling components. So we have a left panel with a list of users, and then a right panel that lets us search those users. And it's taking a while to load. So if we take a look at the user list, we can see that it's getting its list of users from the service because we need to share this list of users between the left and right components. And when I can add users from this left one, and it's just going to user service to add user. I checked out the wrong branch. Let me see here. This would work, which we don't want. We want to see a broken version of this. Unfortunately, I have a million branches on here. Redux demo with server setup. Thought that's what I checked out. Demo service. Yeah, let's try this one. Get a new local branch. I'm already on that branch. I guess I named it something that I'm not remembering. Get child Redux demo. Let's try Redux demo setup. Yeah. Okay, this is looking good. Let's go back to the left components. This is my user list. There we go. Okay, yeah, this is the branch I want. So when I click add user, it's just pushing a new user into this list of users. And if we look at my user service that is being shared between these two components, it's super basic. It's just an empty list of users. So let's take a look at the actual app. So basically, I can add users on the left, and when I add them, they should be reflected on the list on the right. But for some reason, we're not seeing them until I actually try and search something, and then I see all the users on the right show up. And so let's take a look at why that might be happening. If we go into the user search component, so this is where the users aren't showing up, we can see that, again, I've got a function for filtering the users, and it's only being called when I delete a user or in the on key up event when I enter a search text. So when I'm on the other component and I add a new user, my second component isn't being notified of that, and it's not able to update anything. And there's actually even worse problems. If I delete some users over here, they're not reflected on the left. And if I add new users on the left and try my search trick to get that function to run, now I'm not seeing anything. And these two components are totally separate right now. And what's happening there is when I delete a user, if we take a look at this remove user, what I'm doing is taking that list of users on the user service and setting it to a new list. But my component on the left, the user list component, when it initializes, it takes the original list from the service and stores it in a variable. So when I set that list to a new variable, now these are referring to totally different lists. And this is a pretty easy problem to avoid. I could just refer to my user service.users directly instead of storing it, but it's a really common problem to run into. I run into it all the time on Angular 1 apps. And the other problem we ran into where the components don't know to update when one of the components changes the list of users is a much harder problem to deal with. Because if you think about it, my user list service, there's no way to really know when someone has pushed a new value into this or something like that. So let's take a look at what we could do to sort of rewrite this user service to fix both of these bugs. So here's my current user service. It's just an array of users. And the problem is that no one knows when this array of users changes, so no one can respond to those changes. I'm going to rewrite this using observables. So instead of just a mutable list, I'm going to have an observable that is a stream of events, and each of those events will be the most recent state that that list is in. And behavior subject is just a type of observable that is good for this. Basically, you give it an initial value, and it'll always keep track of what the last, most up-to-date version of in this stream of events is. And that's really all we care about here is we just want to know, what the most recent version of users is. So now that I'm not just using a plain array, how would I actually add a user to this behavior subject? So I can do it with something like this. So I'm going to have an add users function that takes a user in, and it's going to concatenate that user onto the previous value from that observable. So I can get the sort of current state of my list of users by calling getValue on this behavior subject, and then I'm just adding a new user onto it, and then I'm calling .next, and this will broadcast that change out to anyone who is subscribed to this observable. Removing a user is pretty much the same. I'm just going to get the current value for it, compute what I think the next value should be, and then broadcast that out as the current state of this observable. If any of the components want to just get the users themselves, I'm going to return it as an observable. And all this really does is removes the .next function so that nowhere else in my application can anywhere modify what the state is for these users. So I now have this one centralized place where user state is stored and modified, and everywhere else can just subscribe to it or call the functions on it to update that. All right, so now that I've rewritten the service, I'm going to have to update how I'm actually using the service in my code. So first of all, instead of just storing a list of users, I'm going to now store an observable of users so that this automatically gets updated. and I'm going to just inject this user service and grab that observable in my constructor. Next up, how do I iterate over this observable? So we could subscribe to it in the constructor and have a function that runs whenever it changes and store that in another variable. But as we learned in the last talk, you can run into memory leaks with that. You have to remember to tear down all your subscriptions. And an easier way to do that is just to use Angular's async pipe. So with this async pipe, Angular will automatically subscribe to this observable for me and update this ng4 whenever it changes. And I don't have to worry about memory leaks or cleaning up any subscriptions. All right, next up, I'm going to totally redo how we are refiltering the users. So I'm going to start this by creating yet another observable. So I'm going to create an observable of search terms. So whenever the user types something into this search box, I'm going to emit a new event that is the value of that search box. So I now have an observable of the full list of users and an observable of the search terms. And I want to basically recompute what the filtered list of users is whenever either one of those changes. So I can do that by replacing, so instead of just getting the full list of users, I'm just going to store an observable of filtered users. And I can do that with observable.combineLatest. So what this does is it's going to take two observables. The first one is the full list of users. The next one is the most recent search term. And then it will call a function for me whenever either one of those gets a new value, where I can do some processing with the most recent versions of each. So whenever that happens, I'm just going to filter the list of users with the most recent search term. And what I'll get returned from this combine latest is a new observable of users that is the filtered users, not the full list of users. So if I lost you there, that's all right. This stuff gets pretty confusing when you start dealing with these higher order RxJS functions. Here's a graphical representation of that really helped me sort of understand what's happening. So this is combine latest. The first line here is an observable and the dots on it are events. Second line is another observable with the dots on it events. And what happens if I run combine latest on this is the first event fires and we don't see anything happen in the output because I haven't gotten an event on my second observable yet. Then I get this event on my second observable firing and my combine latest function runs and I'm able to combine the values from both observables. So I combine 1 and A and I output this 1A. Then when the 2 gets fired, again, it just grabs the most recent values from each. So I combine the 2 and the A and I output 2A. So this is essentially what I'm doing just with my full list of users and my search terms. Just whenever either one of them changes, I recombine them by reperforming that filter and output this new observable of filtered lists of users. All right, so let's go back to the slides. So there's one more thing that the search component is doing, and that's removing the user. So the way it used to work is whenever the user got removed, it would go find the current list of users from the service, recalculate what the new list should be, and then rerun the filtering of users. But now that I have just this one centralized place where my users get updated, I can just call this function on my user service to remove a user and not have to worry about re-triggering updates of my search function or other components not getting that update. So let's take a look at a flowchart of what happens when I click remove user on this component. So when my app starts up, I have my user service, and let's say it has a few default users in there. And now I have my list component on the left and my search component on the right, and they're both subscribed to this list of users. So they're going to get the list of users and render that out onto the UI. Now when I click the X on my search component, I'm going to call this remove user function on the user service. The user service is responsible for storing then and updating that state. So it will compute what the new state should be. So it'll get rid of that user 2. And then it'll fire an event out to anyone who's subscribed. So the search component and list component will be able to update their views to remove that user. And if this diagram is starting to look familiar, it's probably because you've done some Redux before. This is a diagram of what Redux looks like, and I'm basically doing the exact same thing. Instead of actions, I'm just calling methods. I'm calling remove user. Instead of a reducer, I just have a service with functions. And instead of the way that state is handled in React and Redux, I just have these observables that you can subscribe to get the most latest state. But we can actually take this one step further and use a Redux library for Angular. There's a couple out there. I'm just going to go through using RxJS ngStore to rewrite this with more Redux-aligned syntax. But really what's happening behind the scenes will be the same as the way it's currently functioning. OK, so for starters, I'm just going to comment out this whole class and wrap it in a function. Because with Redux, you're not using classes, you just have this one reducer function. And your reducer function is going to get the current state of your users and some action you want to perform on the users. And the reducer is responsible for combining that action with the current state and computing what the future state should be. So instead of just calling functions on a class, I'm going to have a switch case that looks at the type of action that got passed in. So we'll replace those function names with these case statements. And when someone passes in create user, I'm basically going to do the same code I did before, where I just got the users and got the existing users and computed the new state. But now I don't need to worry about manually broadcasting that. I can just return that value. So I can just return the users and some new user, and Redux will take care of broadcasting that out to everyone. Same thing with delete users. I can just worry about computing the new state. So I'm going to take my current state of users and filter out the ones that don't match this ID that I passed into the action. And for the default state, where I just want to get the list of users back, I can just return this users that got passed into me. All right, so now that we've rewritten this as a reducer, we're going to have to update our component once again. But first of all, we need to register that reducer with Angular. So I can use this store module .provide store and tell it if anyone wants to get at this user store to use this user reducer. OK, so now here's in our component. I'm obviously going to need to update anywhere that I'm using the user service, because that service no longer exists, and I just have this reducer now. But because these ways of handling state are so similar, these are actually the only lines of code I'm going to need to touch, and all the rest of the logic can stay the exact same. So for starters, instead of injecting the service, I'm going to inject the store. And this will have all of the state, not just my users. So to get that list of users, I need to select the users from it, like so. And now the only other thing I need to change is, instead of calling remove user, I'm going to dispatch an action. So I'll dispatch this delete user, which matches that switch case statement I had, and we'll pass in the ID of the user we want to change. And I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. So just to summarize everything, everything is in a component in Angular 2. If you're coming from a framework that didn't have components, it really helps to start learning to think in components, and all your organization and encapsulation kind of happens through components. For communicating between a parent and a child, from the parent to the child, you can use these input bindings to just pass values into the child. If the child needs to respond to changes, it can use an ES6 setter or the ng-on-changes function to respond to those changes. Sometimes you just want a bit more control and you want to grab the actual component itself. And in those cases, you could use something like viewChild. You definitely want to use this pretty sparingly because so the input bindings are a lot simpler. There's a lot more ways you can sort of shoot yourself in the foot with the viewChild, and fewer optimizations you can do around change detection, but sometimes you need to use it, and it's handy to have it there. For communicating from a child to a parent, we can use these output bindings. We can send an event up to the parent using an event emitter, and then bind to it in the parent with the round bracket syntax, and do some custom handling of that event. And in cases where you can't use output, like the example we saw with the router where we couldn't actually bind directly to the child component, you can actually inject the parent component directly into the child. But again, you're opening yourself up to a much bigger API, so you're going to have to do a lot more unit testing, and you want to avoid that if you don't actually have to use it. For sibling-to-sibling communication, we saw that we could use a service to communicate between them, but that we could run into some troubles if we started using mutable state in that service and just mutating it, because the other sibling component isn't going to know when you mutate that object. So one way we could work around that is to use observables instead of just mutable state and have sort of a stream of events where each event is the most recent state. Another way we can handle that is to use a more sort of formal and overarching library like NGRX store. And this gives us sort of Redux-like syntax and all the benefits you get with something like Redux, like centralized state and one-way data flow. If you want to learn more about these topics, these are some articles where I learned most of this stuff. The Angular Cookbook article on component interaction is definitely the first place to look. It goes through pretty much everything I've covered here. If you want to try out Redux with Angular, you could check out RxJS Store. There's other libraries that do that as well. And there's always some good courses on Egghead if you want to learn more about observables or components or something like that. So that's about it. Again, my name's Rob. I work just down the street at Conrad Group. We're always looking for good people, so if you're looking for a job, give me a shout and we can talk. If you want to hit me up on Twitter, you can get me at RobIanMcD. And if you want to grab the slides, we'll probably put them up on the website, but you can also grab them at tinyurl.com/ng2components. And that's all. So thanks a lot for sticking around.